An Australian colonel walked into the office of a four-star American general in Saigon in the autumn of 1962, placed a written assessment on the desk, and told the most powerful military commander in South Vietnam that his understanding of the war was factually, systematically, and dangerously wrong. The colonel did not shout. He did not threaten. He had spent 30 years developing the kind of professional precision that did not require volume. He simply laid out what he had seen with his own eyes in the previous 3 months, in the border provinces where the Viet Cong moved at will, in the villages where the strategic Hamlet program was disintegrating before it had properly begun, in the briefing rooms where American officers read from charts that bore no recognizable relationship to the countryside those same officers had just come back from. And then he waited for a response. The general across that desk had just told President John Kennedy in a direct communication 4 words that would define his command and eventually destroy his reputation. "We are going to win." The colonel's name was Francis Philip Serong. Everyone who knew him called him Ted, and the reports he was about to spend the next 2 years submitting, arguing for, and watching being quietly buried, contained a diagnosis of the American war in Vietnam, so accurate that historians studying declassified documents 4 decades later would find themselves reading his 1962 assessments as though they had been written after Tet. Wait. An Australian colonel commanding 30 men just told a 4-star American general commanding 16,000 advisors and the entire machinery of the Military Assistance Command Vietnam that the war was going wrong? And the general's response was to keep telling Washington everything was fine? This story does not just get stranger. It gets almost unbearably precise, because what makes the story of Ted Serong in Vietnam so difficult to shake loose from your mind is not that he was ignored. Men with good ideas get ignored in wars all the time. What makes it difficult is how specifically, how surgically, how completely right he was, and how completely and deliberately the American command structure had constructed an information system designed to prevent anyone in Washington from knowing it. One document, written in 1963 and buried for years in the classified archives, captured the essential failure of American leadership in Vietnam in a way that press briefings and diplomatic cables never could. It was a diary entry written by Serong himself, watching General Paul Harkins at a briefing on the progress of the war. Serong recorded, in the flat language of a professional soldier documenting what he observed, that Harkins had given the appearance of having lost his grasp of the strategic direction of the war entirely and was prepared to settle for the happenings of the day-to-day trivia. A 4-star general. The man responsible for winning a counterinsurgency settled for the trivia. What follows is the story of why that happened, what one Australian soldier did about it, and why the American machine that was supposed to be winning the war in 1962 had already, in the places that mattered most, begun to lose it. The thing you need to understand about Ted Serong before you can understand what he saw in Vietnam is where he had been in the 20 years before he arrived. Because Serong did not walk into Saigon as a fresh observer. He walked in as a man who had spent the better part of his military career thinking through exactly the kind of war that Vietnam represented, from every possible angle on multiple continents, in multiple languages, against enemies that operated by a logic entirely alien to the conventional Western military tradition he had graduated from. He was born in 1915 in Abbotsford, in working-class inner Melbourne. His father, the son of a Madeiran Portuguese immigrant, had the kind of philosophy about raising sons that produces either soldiers or criminals. He taught his boys to box, and every summer he drove them to the banks of an inland river, left them there with minimal supplies, and came back 2 weeks later to collect whatever was left. It was a brutal and clarifying education, and it produced a man who had an almost complete absence of the fear of institutional disapproval that cripples most soldiers with good ideas. Serong graduated from the Royal Military College at Duntroon in 1937 and spent the Second World War largely in training and staff roles, though he saw direct combat against Japanese forces at Wewak late in the war. But it was what he did after the war that matters. The Pacific campaigns had produced an entire generation of Australian soldiers who understood jungle warfare not as theory, but as survival. They had fought through New Guinea in conditions that killed men as readily as enemy fire did. They had learned, through catastrophic early losses, that the jungle environment nullified Western advantages in firepower and technology, and replaced them with advantages that went to the side that was quieter, more patient, and better able to read the terrain. When the Australian Army set about preserving those lessons after 1945, it built a jungle warfare training centre at Canungra in southeastern Queensland, and in 1955 it gave command of that centre to Serong. What Serong did at Canungra over the following years was not merely administrative. He codified a philosophy of counterinsurgency warfare from the ground up, drawing on the Pacific experience, on the lessons filtering back from British officers who were fighting the communist insurgency in Malaya, and on his own increasingly systematic thinking about the nature of guerrilla conflict. The core of what he taught was simple enough to state and almost impossibly difficult to execute. In counterinsurgency, the decisive terrain was not physical, it was psychological. The decisive objective was not to kill insurgents. It was to protect the population so thoroughly and so consistently that the population stopped providing the insurgents with the intelligence, the food, the recruits, and the cover that any guerrilla force depended on. You could not bomb your way to that objective. You could not artillery your way to it. You could not do it with large formations sweeping through the jungle, making noise and leaving. You did it with small, patient units, operating continuously, building relationships with the population, creating a presence so persistent and so reliable that the insurgents' ability to move freely was slowly, systematically destroyed. He proved it worked by being selected in 1957 over candidates from Israel, America, and Yugoslavia as the counterinsurgency instructor to the armed forces of Burma. And then, from 1960 to 1962, he served as strategic advisor to the Burmese army itself. By the time the CIA station in Rangoon noted the applicability of his methods to Vietnam in 1961, and Secretary of State Dean Rusk asked Canberra for Serong's dispatch south, he had spent more consecutive years studying, teaching, and practicing counterinsurgency doctrine than almost any military officer alive in any country. He was 46 years old. He had never lost a war, and he had never, not once in 30 years of professional study, encountered any evidence that the approach being assembled in Saigon by the Military Assistance Command Vietnam would produce anything except catastrophic failure. General Paul Harkins was everything Ted Serong was not, in the precise ways that mattered most for Vietnam. Harkins was a product of West Point, class of 1929, a cavalryman's cavalryman who had come of age in the great conventional campaigns of the Second World War as General George Patton's deputy chief of staff. He had ridden with Patton from North Africa through Sicily and into the heart of Germany, And what he had absorbed in those campaigns, at the deepest level of his professional instinct, was a doctrine of warfare built around mass, speed, and concentrated firepower. Find the enemy. Fix the enemy. Destroy the enemy with overwhelming force. That was how you won a war. That was how wars were supposed to be won. He arrived in Vietnam in February 1962 as the first commander of the newly created Military Assistance Command Vietnam, and he brought that doctrine with him. What he did not bring, and what no American military academy had seen fit to teach, was any serious understanding of counterinsurgency. Harkins and his staff had not studied the British experience in Malaya. They had not absorbed the lessons of the French defeat in Indochina, which was still less than a decade old. They had not grappled with the fundamental insight that a guerrilla insurgency cannot be defeated through the same methods that defeat a conventional army, because a guerrilla insurgency is not organized to fight the way a conventional army fights, and if you attack it as though it were, it simply disappears into the population and waits until you leave. What Harkins brought instead was optimism, not the cautious, evidence-based optimism of a professional who has studied a difficult problem and believes it is solvable. The institutional optimism of a man who had been selected by people who needed good news, who had been placed in charge of a mission the White House needed to succeed, and who had absorbed, somewhere along the way, the belief that his job was to produce the right assessments rather than the accurate ones. From the moment he arrived in country, Harkins projected confidence that the war was being won. At the first major Secretary of Defense conference he chaired in July 1962, he opened by informing the assembled officers that there was no doubt whatsoever that America was on the winning side. If programs continued, he said, Viet Cong actions would decline. The strategic Hamlet program was producing Hamlets by the thousands. The ARVN, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, was improving. Body counts were good. The members of the American Press Corps in Saigon, men like David Halberstam of the New York Times and Neil Sheehan, nicknamed him General Blimp after the cartoon character Colonel Blimp, the pompous British officer who inflated every military situation into a triumph regardless of what the facts suggested. The nickname stuck because it was accurate, and because Harkins controlled what went into the reports to Washington, and Washington controlled what the president heard, and the president needed to believe things were going well in Vietnam. The nickname did not derail his command. It merely described it. Serong arrived in Saigon in July 1962, leading 30 Australian soldiers, and what he brought with him beyond those men was the specific weight of a man who already knew what he thought. He had made 2 reconnaissance tours of South Vietnam on his own time and at his own expense in May 1962, before his formal assignment, and the notes he took during those tours were not polite. He recorded, under the heading General Situation, that things were worse than he had been led to believe, and worsening. The Viet Cong plan was developing steadily. The government's plan was developing on paper only. Strategic policy was passive and reactionary, not active. There was no unified control of the counterinsurgency effort. And then, in language that did not hedge and did not qualify, he wrote about the man he was about to serve under. General Harkins had not grasped the nature of his task. Serong's official role was counterinsurgency advisor to the commander of MACV. In theory, this made him the senior professional advisor on the exact type of war being fought. In practice, it made him a man with a title and no authority. Because Harkins did not believe in counterinsurgency and did not want a counterinsurgency advisor, Harkins wanted a show of Allied flags. He wanted Australian soldiers present in Vietnam as proof that the war had international support. He did not want an Australian colonel sitting across his desk explaining that the entire conceptual framework May CV was operating under was built on a category error about the nature of the conflict. But Serong submitted the reports anyway. From his very first months in country, he was filing assessments that directly contradicted the official MACV line. He was watching the Strategic Hamlet program, and what he saw appalled him. On paper, the program was proceeding at extraordinary speed. By mid-1962, thousands of hamlets had been constructed across South Vietnam, enormous numbers by any measure, the kind of numbers that looked spectacular in charts prepared for Washington briefings. The program's logic was borrowed from the British experience in Malaya, where resettling the rural population into defended villages had successfully cut the communist insurgency off from its support base in the countryside. Robert Thompson, the British officer who had helped design the Malayan approach, was in Saigon advising on its adaptation to Vietnam, and Thompson too was watching the numbers with growing unease. The problem was the speed. In Malaya, the resettlement program had moved slowly, area by area, consolidating government control in one district before moving to the next, ensuring that each hamlet was genuinely secure before claiming it as a success. In Vietnam, the program was being driven by a demand for numbers. Ngo Dinh Nhu, the brother of President Diem, and the man who effectively ran the program, had turned hamlet construction into something resembling a competition between provinces. Hamlets were being built without adequate defenses. They were being built in areas where the Viet Cong were already well established. They were being built too quickly, in too many places at once, leaving gaps in the security coverage that the insurgents exploited almost immediately. And the men who were supposed to defend them, the Civil Guard units, and the Self-Defense Corps that formed the bottom layer of South Vietnam's security architecture, were undertrained, under-equipped, and in many cases actively intimidated by the local Viet Cong infrastructure they were theoretically supposed to suppress. Serong saw all of this. He documented all of this. He submitted reports explaining that the Strategic Hamlet program was overextended, advancing too quickly without consolidation, and was being measured by the wrong indicators. The number of hamlets built was not a measurement of security. The only real measurement of progress in a counterinsurgency was the degree to which the population voluntarily provided intelligence to government forces, because that was the indicator of whether the population believed the government could actually protect them. By that measure, in September 1962, the program was failing. Territory along the borders was being lost in Viet Cong incursions. The numbers in the Viet Cong were growing, not shrinking, and the May CV reports going to Washington said the opposite. Understanding why those May CV reports said the opposite requires understanding how the information system worked inside the American command in 1962. The problem was not simply that Harkins was lying, though there were moments when his publicly stated positions bore so little resemblance to what junior officers were seeing in the field that the distinction between optimism and dishonesty became difficult to maintain. The deeper problem was structural. American military culture in the early 1960s had developed a measurement system for Vietnam built entirely around metrics that were easy to count and difficult to argue with. Missions flown, artillery rounds expended, hamlets constructed, Viet Cong killed, the infamous body count that would become one of the defining horror stories of the American military experience in Vietnam. These numbers were easy to report. They went up predictably over time. They were the kind of numbers that looked good in Secretary of Defense briefings, and they measured almost nothing that mattered in a counterinsurgency. You could fly more missions and lose more of the population's confidence simultaneously if those missions killed civilians or destroyed the crops that farmers needed to survive. You could build more hamlets and extend Viet Cong influence simultaneously if the hamlets were built in the wrong places and defended by forces the local population did not trust. You could kill more Viet Cong and watch the insurgency grow simultaneously, because the insurgency's ability to recruit from a population that resented the government's conduct was nearly inexhaustible. The numbers told a story. They just did not tell the true one. At every level of the American command structure in 1962, there was an implicit and sometimes explicit pressure to produce good numbers. American officers serving as advisors to ARVN units understood that their careers depended on the performance metrics of the units they advised. If the units they advised showed poor performance, the advisors' efficiency reports suffered. So advisors had a personal incentive to interpret performance generously. The ARVN commanders they were advising had a different but parallel incentive. Diem's South Vietnamese government valued loyalty over competence. Commanders who produced good results for Diem, who avoided losses, who reported success, kept their positions. Commanders who risked their forces in aggressive operations that produced casualties, even when those operations achieved genuine military objectives, risked being relieved. The entire system pushed toward a systematic inflation of positive indicators. Serong understood this. He had watched the same phenomenon, in less extreme form, in Burma, where the difference between reported results and actual results in counterinsurgency operations was a standing joke among the officers he advised. He also understood something that many of the American officers arguing with May-CV's numbers at the junior level did not fully grasp: that the problem was not isolated to this or that unit, this or that province, this or that commander. The problem was the framework itself. You could not fix the numbers by improving individual reporting. You could only fix them by changing what was being measured and why, which required accepting that the entire conceptual basis of the American mission in Vietnam needed to be revised. And that was not a message anyone above the rank of colonel was prepared to receive in 1962. By the early months of 1963, Serong was writing diary entries that read like a transcript of a slow-motion catastrophe. At a briefing in February of that year, he watched Harkins present to assembled officers and concluded in his private notes that Harkins had given the appearance of having lost his grasp of the strategic direction entirely. The phrase is precise and devastating. Gave the appearance. It was the language of a professional soldier, maintaining the last millimeter of formal courtesy while recording what he actually believed, which was that the man responsible for winning the war did not understand the war he was supposed to win. The information was flowing outward from Saigon in ways that Serong could track. The CIA station in Saigon, run by John Richardson, was interested in what Serong was producing. The agency's Saigon station had a far better read on the actual situation in the countryside than May-CV did, partly because the CIA was running its own networks of Vietnamese agents and informants outside the formal military command structure, and partly because the CIA's mission required it to understand what was actually happening, rather than what the official reports said was happening. Richardson sought out Serong's analyses. He circulated them within the agency's reporting channel as a counterweight to the optimism coming out of MRCV, Journalists were interested too. Halberstam of the New York Times, who was developing the most detailed and credible independent picture of the war's actual progress of any reporter in Saigon, talked to Serong. What Serong was telling the CIA and the journalists did not appear in the official MACV dispatches going to Washington. Then, on January 2, 1963, the Battle of Ap-Bac settled the argument about whether the American command's assessment of ARVN capabilities bore any relationship to reality. It settled it in the most public and humiliating way possible. Ap-Bac was a small hamlet in the Mekong Delta in Din Tuong Province, about 40 miles southwest of Saigon. American Signals Intelligence had located a Viet Cong radio transmitter in the area, and the plan developed by the ARVN 7th Division and its American advisor, Lieutenant Colonel John Paul Van, was designed to be overwhelming. The operation had every advantage. ARVN forces outnumbered the estimated Viet Cong force by 10 to 1. They had helicopter transport, armored personnel carriers, artillery support, and airstrikes available. The enemy, a Viet Cong main force company defending a tree line, had none of those things. By any rational assessment based on the kind of analysis MACV had been presenting to Washington, the result should have been swift and conclusive. What actually happened was a catastrophe that took an entire day and required 5 American helicopters to be shot down before anyone in authority could fully absorb that things were going badly. The Viet Cong, dug into well-prepared positions in a tree line, held their ground with extraordinary fire discipline. ARVN units that were supposed to advance refused to move, their commanders unwilling to take casualties that would reflect poorly on their records. Armored personnel carriers that should have swept the Viet Cong positions sat stationary while their commanders found reasons not to advance. An airborne battalion dropped into the wrong position because the ARVN general had ordered it, despite American objections. By the time darkness fell and the Viet Cong simply walked away through gaps in the ARVN perimeter, carrying most of their dead and wounded and leaving almost no trace, 80 South Vietnamese soldiers were dead. 3 Americans were dead. 5 helicopters were wrecked in the rice paddies, and the hamlet had not been held. Van was incandescent. Standing at the battlefield afterward in the presence of international journalists, he did not bother to modulate his language. It was a miserable damn performance, he said, just like it always is. The journalists wrote it down. The story went around the world. The press was asking directly and publicly whether what the American command had been saying about ARVN capability was accurate. Harkins responded the next day by telling reporters that Ap-Bac was actually a success because ARVN forces had eventually moved into the hamlet and reclaimed it. He defended the South Vietnamese soldiers in official statements, describing their courage and their fighting spirit. He kept producing optimistic assessments. Serong had not been at Ap-Bac, but he had predicted it. Not that specific battle, but the category of event it represented, and the category of institutional response that would follow. His reports had said the ARVN's willingness to close with the enemy was contingent on political factors that had nothing to do with military effectiveness. His reports had said the Strategic Hamlet Program was creating a false picture of security in the Delta provinces. His reports had said that the indicators being used to measure progress were disconnected from what was actually happening in the villages. Ap-Bac was not an anomaly. Ap-Bac was what happened when the gap between the reported war and the real war became too wide to maintain in a single afternoon's firefight. In May 1963, Serong traveled to the United States. He had been invited to lecture at the Special Forces Training School at Fort Bragg in North Carolina by Major General William Yarborough, and he used the trip to press his case in Washington at the highest levels he could reach. He met with representatives of the National Security Council. He elaborated on his analysis of the war's progress to audiences who were not under Harkins's direct authority and who therefore had some professional distance from the official MACV line. At Fort Bragg, in language calibrated to be heard by an American audience that was not yet ready for the full depth of his pessimism, he made the essential point about what progress in counterinsurgency actually looked like. You could get impressive figures from counting missions flown, casualties taken and inflicted, stores delivered, ammunition expended, but none of those figures told you whether you were winning or losing. The only genuine indicator of progress in a war of counterinsurgency was the volume of intelligence spontaneously offered by the population, because that was the indicator of whether the population believed the government could actually protect them. If the people trusted the government to protect them, they told government forces where the insurgents were. If they did not trust the government, they told the insurgents where government forces were. Everything else was noise. He was received warmly in Washington. His tactical training methods were genuinely impressive, and American Special Forces had already begun incorporating elements of the Conungra approach into their own training. He was feted, listened to, treated with respect. His analysis of the strategic Hamlet program's overextension was noted, even agreed with by some of the civilians he spoke to. And then he was thanked and sent back to Saigon, and the structural decisions that would have required acting on his analysis, the decisions about what American strategy in Vietnam actually was, what it was actually trying to achieve, and what it would cost to achieve it, those decisions remained exactly where they had been before he arrived. This was the problem he called the problem of the junior ally. His rank was colonel. He commanded 30 men. The American commitment, by 1963, numbered more than 16,000 soldiers with an enormous logistics tail, an aviation corps, a medical infrastructure, artillery support, and a chain of command that ran from Saigon through Hawaii to the Pentagon and ultimately to the Oval Office. In that context, a colonel with 30 men and a diagnosis of what was wrong had exactly the leverage that his institutional position implied, enough to be heard in the right rooms, not enough to change anything that required decisions above his pay grade. He could advise, he had no authority, and the people with authority had made up their minds that the war was going well. The wider context of what Serong was observing in 1962 and 1963 matters for understanding why his reports were buried rather than acted on. The American commitment to South Vietnam was not primarily a military decision in those years. It was a political one. The Kennedy administration had inherited an advisory mission from Eisenhower and had expanded it enormously, from a few hundred advisors in 1961 to more than 16,000 by the end of 1963. Kennedy was managing the optics of that expansion against a domestic political context that did not want another Asian land war, and an international context in which the credibility of American commitments worldwide depended on the appearance of competent engagement in Vietnam. He needed the war to be going well. He needed the numbers to support that narrative. Harkins was producing numbers that supported the narrative. Serong was producing analysis that undermined it. There was also a structural reality about the American military culture of the early Cold War period that made Serong's kind of thinking almost invisible to the senior commanders who most needed it. The American army that arrived in Vietnam had been built, trained, equipped, and mentally oriented for a specific and very different kind of war. The central planning assumption of American military doctrine in the 1950s and early 1960s was a conventional confrontation with Soviet forces in Europe. Massed armor, coordinated air support, nuclear escalation options, the massive logistical infrastructure of a superpower military grinding against another superpower military. The Army had been optimized for that war. Its promotion systems rewarded the officers who understood that war. Its training doctrine taught that war. Its measurement systems were designed to evaluate readiness for that war. Counterinsurgency, as Serong understood it, required almost the inverse of every quality the American Army had been optimizing for. It required patience rather than speed, restraint with firepower rather than its lavish application, intimate knowledge of the local population rather than operational distance from it, success measured in years rather than weeks, results that were invisible in conventional metrics for long periods before they became undeniable. And, above all, it required the intellectual humility to accept that the framework being applied might be wrong and would need to be changed even at significant cost to institutional pride. That humility was not available in the MyCV of 1962. Harkins had been placed in Vietnam to win, and he intended to win in the way American generals won things, which was to bring overwhelming resources to bear and keep reporting progress until the war was over. The reports going to Washington reflected that intention. They did not reflect the countryside. By late 1963, the structure was beginning to visibly crack from multiple directions at once. Neil Sheehan, David Halberstam, and the small press corps in Saigon had been reporting consistently based on conversations with junior officers and on what they could see themselves, that the official version of the war did not match the reality. The Kennedy administration was sufficiently alarmed that it had dispatched a series of high-level observers, including General Maxwell Taylor and Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, to assess whether Harkins's optimism was justified. Their reports were mixed, with the civilians from the State Department and the CIA consistently more pessimistic than the military officers. The assessments flowing back to Washington were giving wildly inconsistent pictures of the same war, some citing early victory as achievable, others describing a rapidly deteriorating military situation. The Diem regime was simultaneously unraveling. The Buddhist crisis of mid-1963, in which government security forces had attacked peaceful Buddhist demonstrators and burned their pagodas, had created a domestic political catastrophe that made the already difficult work of population security nearly impossible. Diem's brother Nhu was making public statements of stunning diplomatic recklessness. The strategic Hamlet program was collapsing in many provinces as Serong had predicted it would, overwhelmed by the combination of poor construction, inadequate security forces, and a Viet Cong that had correctly identified the program as an existential threat and was attacking hamlets wherever it found them vulnerable. In November 1963, Diem and Nhu were overthrown and killed in a coup that the American government had done nothing to prevent and much to encourage. The coup plunged South Vietnam into a period of political instability that would produce 6 different governments in the next 13 months. Every time a government changed in Saigon, province chiefs and military commanders loyal to the previous regime were purged and replaced by men loyal to the new one. The accumulated institutional knowledge of how to fight the insurgency in specific provinces, the relationships between commanders and local intelligence sources, the carefully built security structures in the hamlets that were actually working. All of it was reset every time power changed hands. The ARVN's 9 reserve battalions, which had existed as a strategic reserve capable of responding to major Viet Cong offensives, essentially ceased to exist by late 1964. The members had deserted or been incapacitated or had been dispersed through the succession of coups. Harkins was replaced in June 1964 by General William Westmoreland, who brought his own brand of optimism and his own preference for large unit conventional operations. By 1965, the situation had deteriorated so completely that President Lyndon Johnson committed American ground combat forces to Vietnam in large numbers, beginning the escalation that would eventually bring more than 500,000 American soldiers to a war that the advisory mission of 1962 was supposed to have made unnecessary. Serong himself stayed in Vietnam long after his formal command of the Australian Army training team ended in 1965. That is a story almost as extraordinary as the one that brought him there, though it moved into territory seconded to the CIA, advising on the police field force program, working in the shadows of the American intelligence apparatus that belongs to a different history. What belongs to this one is the summary of what he had told anyone willing to listen between 1962 and 1965, and the degree to which the American command structure had declined to hear it. He had told them that the strategic Hamlet program was overextended, advancing too quickly without consolidation, and that the gap between the number of Hamlets built and the number of Hamlets genuinely secure was a chasm that the Viet Cong were exploiting freely. The program collapsed formally after Diem's death and informally long before it. He had told them that the MICV reports of progress were disconnected from the reality in the countryside, that body count and Hamlet construction numbers were measuring the wrong things and measuring even those things badly. The Pentagon Papers, released in 1971, would document in exhaustive classified detail the systematic gap between what American officials told the public and what they told each other, a gap that had been opening since the earliest days of the advisory mission. He had told them that the ARVN's willingness to fight aggressively was constrained by political factors inside the South Vietnamese command that American firepower and equipment could not overcome. That remained true through the entire duration of the war. He had told them that a unified command structure integrating American and South Vietnamese military decision-making into a single authority was essential for coherent strategy. That never happened. He had told them that winning the population's confidence through consistent, reliable security was the only real metric that mattered. That remained the defining failure of the American effort from first to last. The classified assessment, written by a Military Assistance Command Vietnam intelligence officer in 1970, surfacing from the archives years later, contained 7 words about the Australians that explained everything about why the gap between their methods and American methods had mattered so much. They fight wars we forgot how to. Serong had not forgotten. He had known what this war required before he set foot in it. He had carried that knowledge into Harkins's office, into reports that went to the CIA and to journalists, and eventually fragments of them to history. What he could not do was make the American Army want to hear it, because the American Army in 1962 had not yet suffered enough to need the truth more than it needed the right numbers. That reckoning came later. It came in the rice paddies of the Mekong Delta where APBAC happened. It came in the rubber plantations and the border provinces where the Viet Cong rebuilt everything Harkins's statistics claimed had been destroyed. It came in the Tet Offensive of 1968, when an enemy that MACV had been declaring nearly defeated for years materialized simultaneously in 30 cities across South Vietnam, and the American public concluded, in a week of televised battles, that the optimism had been false from the beginning. By then, Ted Serong had been in Vietnam for 6 years. He had been right for 6 years. The 4 stars on Harkins's collar had ensured that being right in 1962 and 1963 was not enough. There is a particular quality to the professional frustration of a man who has done the intellectual work required to understand a problem clearly, who has submitted the reports, made the argument, walked it up whatever chain of command will receive it, and watched it be absorbed and buried and contradicted by the institutional machinery of a more powerful ally pursuing its own needs and its own narrative. It is not helplessness, exactly, because a man like Serong was not constituted for helplessness. He stayed. He kept filing. He adapted. When the American formal command structure would not hear him, he found the CIA and the journalists and the officers at Fort Bragg who would. When his formal role ended, he found a new one. He was still in Saigon in April 1975 when the last American helicopters left the roof of the embassy, and even then, at the very end, he was the man President Thieu called on for advice about whether anything could still be saved. But the frustration is there in the diary entries, in the careful language of a professional who is documenting what he observes without permitting himself the luxury of rage. At tonight's briefing, Harkins gave the appearance of having lost his grasp of the strategic direction of the war, and was prepared to settle for the happenings of the day-to-day trivia. That sentence, written in February 1963 in a private diary by a colonel with 30 men, in a war being run by a general with 16,000, contains the essential tension of the American advisory mission to Vietnam. The man with the smaller force had understood the war. The man with the larger one was settling for the trivia. And the mechanism that was supposed to translate understanding into strategy, the chain of command, the advisory relationship, the reporting system, had been constructed in a way that guaranteed the trivia would be amplified and the understanding suppressed. What Serong represented, and what his experience in those early years represents for the history of the war, is the cost of that construction. Not the obvious cost, the 58,000 American names on the wall in Washington, the more than 2 million Vietnamese dead, the decades of trauma that shaped both countries' understanding of what military power can and cannot achieve. That cost is enormous and has been documented. The subtler cost, the one that Serong's story illuminates, is the cost of the information system itself, the cost of building an advisory command around the production of good numbers rather than accurate ones, the cost of placing at its head a man who believed his job was to project confidence rather than generate knowledge, the cost of treating Allied officers with genuine expertise in exactly the kind of war being fought as inconvenient voices to be heard politely and quietly disregarded. Every American officer who served in Vietnam and came home understanding that the official narrative had borne no relationship to what they had seen in the field had encountered some version of what Serong encountered in Harkins's office. The difference was that Serong had understood it before he arrived. He had watched it coming from 8,000 miles away in his reconnaissance notes from May 1962. In the assessment he wrote under general situation, worse than I had been led to believe, and worsening. He had tried to prevent it. He had failed, not through any failure of his own analysis, but through the irreducible fact that the machine of the American commitment to Vietnam in 1962 was not built to receive the kind of truth he was offering. It was built to produce a different kind of truth, the kind that fit the briefing charts, the kind that kept the four stars' confidence intact, the kind that let a president tell the American people that the war was going well. That truth had a shelf life. When it expired, the real one was waiting. Your reports are wrong. The reports were wrong from the beginning. One Australian colonel had said so, quietly and precisely and in writing, in the very first months of the American command's existence in Vietnam. It took the American military establishment another decade of war to fully accept it, and they are still in classrooms and after-action reviews and military history courses that study the counterinsurgency doctrine assembled from the wreckage, still working out exactly what that acceptance means. Ted Serong died in Melbourne in October 2002. He was 86 years old. He had been the longest-serving Western advisor in the Vietnam War. His reports are in the archives. They are still worth reading.